All right, welcome to our next lecture in the book of Hebrews. This is the New Covenant and Atonement in Hebrews chapter 8 through chapter 10. We have previously passed through the idea of Jesus as a high priest and the author establishing Jesus' identity as a high priest, not of a Levitical origin or as a descendant of Aaron, but as a high priest of the order of Melchizedek, who is this powerful life, this powerful, indestructible life is what Jesus has and what qualifies him in that way. And he's been appointed with an oath by God. And so now we enter into a new section in which the author is going to tie together this notion of the inauguration of a new covenant by means of the death of Jesus, and that the death of Jesus is also going to offer this means of the offering of a sacrifice in a greater tabernacle. And so we're gonna fuse. The author is going to fuse these two ideas of covenant and the cultic sacrifice of the high priest, and going to fuse these two ideas together. And really, they're going to come together in the quotation of of Jeremiah chapter 31. And we're going to walk through this. But as we start, we begin with this section in 8, 1 through 7. And this is a very nice segue where we've just talked about Melchizedek as a high priest, and the author just pauses to say, look, the main point in what we're trying to say is this, and that we have a high priest, and he's established not like the Levitical or Aaronic high priests, but a Melchizedekian high priest. And this high priest does not stand ministering. This high priest has completed his work and is seated at the right hand of God, the throne of majesty. And he's not seated or standing or working on the earth in the earthly tabernacle, but he has been seated and is done in the heavens. He is seated at the right hand of God, and this is a really interesting phrase, that he is a minister in the sanctuary, the true tent, that the Lord, the phraseology of this, that the Lord has pitched a tent. It's really kind of interesting that God in the heavens has pitched a tent, a tabernacle, which is really the true tabernacle, that the tabernacle that Moses was told to set up was merely a copy of. And so you have this interesting heaven and earth meeting, and these two kind of mirror images of a true tabernacle and the tabernacle that Moses has set up. And so he walks through this idea about high priests and what this looks like. And we're going to show some pictures below of what this could have looked like. But this idea that, look, they offer worship in a sanctuary, that's a sketch or a shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. And Moses pitched a tent and was told about, look, do it all according to the pattern that you've seen. But Jesus has obtained a more excellent ministry, and that's the idea of this section. So he's now going to make a transition from talking about high priest to now talking about this better covenant, this mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted through better promises. So the way he's referring to the idea of the first covenant, and of course that is referring to, if we were thinking about intertexts and where we would go to look for this first covenant, we would turn to Exodus chapter 24. Exodus 24 is as Moses is coming down off of Mount Sinai, and God says, look, I want to make a covenant with the people of Israel. And so inaugurate this covenant, and Moses reads the law and splashes and sprinkles blood on everybody to inaugurate this covenant. But what the author of Hebrews is going to say is this first covenant is not the ultimate covenant. And he, in order to establish that, he quotes from Jeremiah chapter 31. Or if you're in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, it's Jeremiah 38. So he goes on and he quotes Jeremiah 31, that he says, days are coming when I will establish a new covenant. And of course, this idea of this new covenant is going to be the major focus of this section. And he goes on to talk about what this covenant is like and what it's not like. And he says, it's not going to be like the one that I made when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt. And again, this is allusion to Exodus 24. It's not like that one. It's going to be a new one because, look, we've already established in chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews that they did not continue in that covenant. They were not able to enter the land, and they had abandoned that faithfulness to that covenant. And so the Lord says, I had no concern for them. And but he does go on to say, look, in this new covenant, there's going to be a number of things that take place, but one of the things that will happen, I'll write the law on their hearts, but he will also establish this idea of forgiveness of sins. And so this quotation of Jeremiah 31 is going to function in a couple of ways. It's going to talk about the new covenant, but it's also going to talk about the new means by which God takes care of the sin issue. Under the first covenant, he does it through Levitical priests and sacrifices. Under this new covenant, he is going to do it finally and ultimately and decisively through the work of Jesus and Jesus' death on the cross. So, in doing so, this idea of a new covenant, we have this idea that he has made the first one obsolete. And of course, this brings up all kinds of questions about the theology of Hebrews and what Hebrews thinks of Second Temple Judaism and what do we do with all that. And that there's going to be some reading on that you'll be doing. But it certainly is a question to keep in mind is what is the status of this previous covenant or of what we would know today as rabbinical Judaism. And certainly the author is very Jewish in the argumentation, and so, but speaks very forcibly about this, that it's obsolete and growing old and will soon disappear. And so we have to take these ideas to heart and to ask very nuanced questions about what precisely it is that he means by this, or the author means by this. All right, we move into the next section, and here we have in 9, 1 through 10, the author is going to launch into a section in which he is going to describe all the provisions for this first covenant worship and sanctuary. And he starts out by saying, now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly sanctuary. And these are a couple of photos of reconstructed tabernacle experiences. And you can see this outer curtain, and then you have the tabernacle itself. You have an altar out here. You have a place where blood can be put here. And then inside the tabernacle, you would walk in these curtains, and there is this outer, the holy place, where priests could go often and bring in blood and take care of the various regulations throughout the year. You've got the lampstand, you've got the bread. But once a year, you have, and here we have our little high priest action figure as entering into the Holy of Holies, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant is. And he would be able to do that once a year on the Day of Atonement. And so once a year, the priest would go in with blood. And that's what chapter 9, 1 through 10 is really all about, is explaining this process. But I thought these photos might be helpful for you to look at. So Hebrews 9:6, the priest would go continually into the first tent in order to carry out their ritual duties. So this outer room of the first tent, but only the high priest goes into the second, and only once a year. And of course, that is referring to the Day of Atonement ritual that takes place. And we read about that in the book of Leviticus. And you guys are going to be doing an assignment about what the high priest is doing and asking the question, when does atonement take place in that process? Is it at the slaughtering of the animal? Is it at the offering of the blood? And also to ask the question, when does that take place for Jesus? Does it take place on the cross, or does it take place after his ascension and after he goes into heaven and after he goes in? It is an interesting debate that's ongoing right now among Hebrew scholars about, is it at the death of Jesus or is it at the ascension of Jesus that ultimate atonement is accomplished? And so that's kind of an interesting question as we go in and continue on with this. But the point has been that under the first covenant, these gifts and sacrifices cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, that it is an incomplete sort of idea. So the author then moves into how he sees the death of Jesus and what it accomplishes, starting in 9:11, that when the Messiah came as high priest, He came through the greater, more perfect tent. And of course, he's already referred to the idea that God has pitched a tent in heaven, and that's the tent that Jesus is going to enter into. And he enters in not once a year, like the Day of Atonement, but he enters in once for all. And so there is a definitive nature, a once for all kind of idea. And he not only goes in, he not only goes in with blood, but it's not the blood of bulls and goats or goats and calves, but with his own blood. And he does not obtain a temporary stay or a temporary cleansing of sins, but he obtains an eternal redemption. And this notion of this contrast is that's what really the rest of this chapter and into chapter 10 is going to be about, is this contrast between what has gone on in tabernacle worship before and what now is going on or has gone on and been finished by the work of Jesus in this heavenly tabernacle. So he talks about blood, and I've highlighted this, the blood of bulls and goats. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God? And then we get this idea of purifying the conscience for worship. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant. And I've highlighted here the word covenant is the word diatheke in Greek. And the reason I'm highlighting this is to show that there's going to be a play on words that the author is going to use here. And the idea that he's saying, that he's working off of, is that Jesus is the mediator of this new diatheke covenant, this promised eternal inheritance. And this idea of diatheke and inheritance, the issue is, in the Greco-Roman world, a diatheke is oftentimes translated or known as a testament or a will, and that people would draft wills before their death, like they do today, to explain the distributions of their inheritances after their death. And so the author is going to play upon this notion for a brief little interlude here, to make mention of this idea that the death of Jesus has enacted a diatheke. Yes, the diatheke like a covenant, but also a diatheke like a will. It has enacted this idea that now the death of Jesus has inaugurated the reception of the eternal inheritance that has been accomplished. So this death, he goes on to talk about when a will is drafted, when a diatheke is drafted, the death has to be established, and the will then takes effect at the point of this death. So it is a brief interlude, and there is some controversy among Hebrew scholars. You'll probably read that a little bit this week. It is a little bit of a fascinating notion, but this has been called, Harold Attridge called this a pun, that the author is making a pun here on covenant diatheke as also a testamentum or a will. Coming out of that little play on words, he goes back to this idea of blood. And this first diatheke was inaugurated with blood, and the new diatheke is inaugurated with blood. And he then alludes to the inauguration of the first covenant, Exodus 24, saying, when Moses, when he took the blood of bulls and goats and scarlet wool and hyssop, and he sprinkles the scroll and he sprinkles the people. This is Exodus 24. And then he says the idea that this is the blood of the covenant that God has ordained for you. And this idea, the blood of the covenant, is very likely the phraseology where when Jesus celebrates the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, and he says, this is the blood of the covenant, or this is the covenant in my blood, he's probably referring to Exodus 24. So Jesus is inaugurating that in the Last Supper. But here the author of Hebrews is saying that first covenant was inaugurated with blood of bulls and goats, but in the same way, Jesus has, and he goes under the law, is purified, everything is purified with blood. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so now he then talks about it's necessary for these things to be purified with these things, but the heavenly things needed to be inaugurated and purified with better sacrifices than these. And then he goes on to continue his analogy or his comparison about Christ entering in, not to the copy of of the true sanctuary, but he enters into heaven itself, and he appears in the presence of God on our behalf. And so it's the ultimate Day of Atonement sacrifice. It's the ultimate covenant inauguration ceremony, and we have this kind of conflation of these two ideas in these two passages, Exodus 24 and Leviticus's Day of Atonement. But he does so so that he can once for all at the end of the age remove sin by the sacrifice of himself. It's this definitive idea. As we move into the next section, he then is going to the law is a shadow of the good things to come, but it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered year by year, make those perfect who approach. And he goes on to say this very well-known statement: it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So when Christ came into the world, he quotes this psalm, that Psalm 40, that sacrifices and offerings you've not desired, but a body you've prepared for me, and that he has come to do God's will. And then it says he abolishes the first covenant in order to establish the second. And it is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus once for all. And then he goes on to say, make this comparison again. Every priest stands working day after day at his service, offering again and again the same sacrifices that can never take away sins. But what does Jesus do? Jesus, Messiah, he doesn't stand after he offers one sacrifice, not again and again, but a single sacrifice for sins. What does he do? He doesn't stand working. He sits down because the work is done. And where does he sit down? He sits down at the right hand of God, the presence of God. And then he waits again, and then the author goes back to this one of the psalms that's very central, this Melchizedek psalm, and he says he waits until his enemies would be made a footstool for his feet, hearkening back to the Melchizedek psalm in Psalm 110. And then he goes back to Jeremiah 31. This is the covenant that I will make. And he adds in this idea, I will remember their sins and lawless deeds no more. And that seems to be the point that he's getting at. This new covenant is the new Exodus 24, and this work in the tabernacle, the true tabernacle in heaven, accomplishes a once for all forgiveness. And where there is forgiveness, there is no longer an offering for sin. And then the author just begins to, just in one of the most beautiful passages in Hebrews, he says, look, because of all this, you think about all that he has taken them through, Melchizedek, and all this stuff about the shedding of blood and this new covenant. He says, look, because of these things, we have confidence to enter by the blood of Jesus. And so he gives this image where only the high priest could go in, but we follow right behind him by means of the blood of Jesus, by this new and living way that he's opened for us. He's this high priest, and he is open. We ride in right behind him through the curtain that is his flesh. And so we have we have confidence, we have a great high priest, and so he says, look, let us approach. Let us hold fast this confession, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds. And so after establishing this very complex argument about the high priesthood of Jesus, the Melchizedekian high priesthood of Jesus, and the offering of these sacrifices once for all, we have this beautiful section of what we now should do. Confidence, let us approach, let us hold fast. And then we're going to get to the warnings, but then he launches into a very severe warning about thinking about this blood as profane or common, and that is a horrible idea. If you think about this blood that has been spilled once for all, and you think of it as just common, regular, whatever, and you mix that blood, like, watch out. That's a horrible thing to do. And we're going to talk about the warnings in Hebrews near the last week of the class. But anyway, hopefully this was a helpful lecture to give you a sense of where the author is moving in this argument. And I'm looking forward to reading your work on it.